The night air was heavy, the kind that clings to your skin and makes every breath feel weighted with anticipation. Somewhere beyond the darkness, the faint toll of a bell carried across the rooftops a reminder that time was moving forward. Even as history seemed to hold its breath, no banners waved yet, no drums beat, but something was coming. You could feel it in the streets, in the way strangers looked at one another just a moment too long, as if silently asking, "Are you with us or against us?" By day, the city looked almost ordinary. Merchants still haggled over bolts of cloth, the smell of baking bread drifted from the market ovens, and the sun glinted off tiled rooftops as it had for generations. But beneath that familiar surface lay a quiet, restless energy. Rumors moved faster than the wind. Some swore they'd seen armed men slipping down alleyways at dawn. Others whispered of secret meetings held in candlelit rooms where maps were spread out and voices dropped to a dangerous whisper. Everyone knew something was happening, they just didn't know whether it would erupt in a single night or slowly swallow. The city hall. The world beyond the city walls was no calmer. Reports from the countryside spoke of unrest, fields left untended, roads patrolled by uneasy soldiers, and villages that seemed to vanish overnight. This was no isolated moment. What was unfolding here was part of a much larger pattern, threads of discontent stretching far beyond the horizon. And yet, for now, the city waited. Like a theater before the curtain rises, all the pieces were in place: the stage, the actors, the unspoken script. All that remained was for someone to step forward and speak the first line. History often remembers moments like this as sudden explosions, but in truth they are more like the slow tightening of a bowstring. Each day adds tension, each rumor draws it back further, until the release becomes inevitable. On this night, in this city, the bow was nearly drawn to breaking point. What no one knew, what no one could know, was how deeply the events about to unfold would carve themselves into the memory of the nation. Decades later, old men and women would tell their grandchildren of the night. The air itself seemed to hum, when silence was more dangerous than noise, and when a single choice could tilt the balance of an entire era. Somewhere in that darkness, a small group of men and women were preparing to make that choice, and when they did, there would be no turning back. The first spark never looks like much. It can be a word spoken in the wrong ear, a letter intercepted, a meeting that goes 5 minutes too long. In this case, it began with a gathering so small, it could have been mistaken for a friendly supper. But the faces around the table were not chosen by chance, and the papers spread out between the wine cups were not dinner invitations. They had all taken risks to be here. Some traveled under false names, slipping past watchful eyes at the city gates. Others came from within the city itself, abandoning their usual haunts so they could disappear into the anonymity of a back alley. To anyone passing by, the house was unremarkable: shuttered windows, a faint smell of wood smoke, nothing to suggest that inside the future was being weighed like gold on a scale. The leader, if he could be called that, did not shout or pound his fist. His voice was low, measured, as though speaking too loudly might summon the very danger they sought to avoid. He spoke of supplies, how much food could be gathered without arousing suspicion, how many men could be armed without drawing attention from the authorities. Maps were unrolled, candles guttered in their holders, and lines were traced across rivers and roads like threads in a spider's web. They were not naive. Each of them knew the price of failure. In those days, punishment was not a fine or a prison term, it was a noose, or worse. Families could vanish, property could be seized, and names could be struck from public record, as if a person had never existed at all. Still, they stayed. Fear was a constant companion, but so was resolve. Outside, the streets were emptying. A cart rattled by, pulled by a thin horse whose breath steamed in the cool night air. Somewhere far off, a door slammed. The city was tucking itself in, but in this room, no one was thinking of sleep. By the time the meeting broke up, the moon had shifted, and the first hint of frost glittered on the cobblestones. The men and women slipped out one by one, vanishing into shadow. If anyone saw them, they would have looked like nothing more than late-night wanderers. But in truth, each was now carrying more than the weight of their own footsteps. They carried the beginning of something that could not be undone. History would later argue over who first lit the match, but those who were there that night would remember the feeling, the quiet certainty that they had crossed an invisible line. The first spark had been struck, and already the wind was beginning to rise. By morning, the city looked unchanged. Market stalls still creaked open. The smell of fresh bread drifted through the air, and the sound of church bells rolled over the rooftops. But if you listened closely, beneath the rhythm of daily life, there was something else, a subtle tension, like the faint hum before a thunderstorm. It began as whispers. A fisherman claimed to have seen strangers on the docks at night, loading barrels that weren't on any shipping manifest. A shopkeeper swore a customer had tried to pay with coins stamped in another country, their edges worn thin by years of passing through unfamiliar hands. Small things, the kind people dismiss when told in daylight, but that take root in the mind after dark. The authorities heard the whispers too, though they were careful not to show it. To admit concern was to give it legitimacy, and so they smiled, inspected the waits at the market, and moved on. But in the privacy of their offices, they began to take notes, lists of names, sightings, rumors that refused to die. A single phrase appeared over and over in those records: possible unrest. Meanwhile, in taverns and tea-houses, the talk grew bolder. Someone claimed they had overheard a plan to block the main road into the city. Another insisted there were weapons hidden beneath the floorboards of a carpenter's shop. Not all of it was true, but in such times, truth and invention danced so closely together that even the inventors began to believe their own tales. In a small square near the river, an old woman sold apples from a basket. She had lived here all her life, had seen rulers come and go, taxes rise and fall. That morning, she watched as two men paused beside her stall, speaking in low voices. One kept glancing over his shoulder, the other clutched a folded scrap of paper in his fist. They walked away without buying anything, but she remembered their faces. Later, she would swear she saw one of them again marching in the streets. Weeks after the first shots were fired, what no one realized yet was that the real danger wasn't in the plans being made behind locked doors, but in the way the city itself was beginning to change. Distrust seeped into the spaces between neighbors. A borrowed tool wasn't returned on time. Perhaps the borrower had other motives. A sudden trip out of town. Perhaps they were carrying messages to conspirators. It didn't matter if the suspicions were unfounded once planted. They grew wild. The spark from that secret meeting had found kindling here, in these narrow streets and crowded markets. And now, the fire was invisible, but spreading, carried in words, glances, and the uneasy knowledge that something was moving beneath the surface of ordinary life. By morning, the city looked unchanged. Market stalls still creaked open, the smell of fresh bread drifted through the air, and the sound of church bells rolled over the rooftops. But if you listened closely, beneath the rhythm of daily life, there was something else, a subtle tension, like the faint hum before a thunderstorm. It began as whispers. A fisherman claimed to have seen strangers on the docks at night, loading barrels that weren't on any shipping manifest. A shopkeeper swore a customer had tried to pay with coins stamped in another country, their edges worn thin by years of passing through unfamiliar hands. Small things, the kind people dismiss when told in daylight, but that take root in the mind after dark. The authorities heard the whispers too, though they were careful not to show it. To admit concern was to give it legitimacy, and so they smiled, inspected the waits at the market, and moved on. But in the privacy of their offices, they began to take notes, lists of names, sightings, rumors that refused to die. A single phrase appeared over and over in those records: possible unrest. Meanwhile, in taverns and tea-houses, the talk grew bolder. Someone claimed they had overheard a plan to block the main road into the city. Another insisted there were weapons hidden beneath the floorboards of a carpenter's shop. Not all of it was true, but in such times, truth and invention danced so closely together that even the inventors began to believe their own tales. In a small square near the river, an old woman sold apples from a basket. She had lived here all her life, had seen rulers come and go, taxes rise and fall. That morning, she watched as two men paused beside her stall, speaking in low voices. One kept glancing over his shoulder. The other clutched a folded scrap of paper in his fist. They walked away without buying anything, but she remembered their faces. Later, she would swear she saw one of them again marching in the streets. Weeks after the first shots were fired, what no one realized yet was that the real danger wasn't in the plans being made behind locked doors, but in the way the city itself was beginning to change. Distrust seeped into the spaces between neighbors. A borrowed tool wasn't returned on time. Perhaps the borrower had other motives. A sudden trip out of town. Perhaps they were carrying messages to conspirators. It didn't matter if the suspicions were unfounded once planted. They grew wild. The spark from that secret meeting had found kindling here, in these narrow streets and crowded markets. And now, the fire was invisible but spreading, carried in words, glances, and the uneasy knowledge that something was moving beneath the surface of ordinary life. It began with a sound no one could ignore, not the church bells, not the chatter of the marketplace, but the sharp, deliberate strike of boots on cobblestones, measured, inescapable. A column of uniformed men appeared at the far end of the street, their faces blank, their eyes forward. They weren't local guards. Their insignia was unfamiliar, their uniforms cleaner, newer, as if they'd been kept ready for a moment like this. Children, who had been chasing each other between the stalls, froze and drifted back toward their mothers. Merchants fell silent, their hands hovering over baskets of fruit or bolts of cloth. The soldiers didn't speak, but their presence said everything. Authority had shifted, and the city now answered to a different will. At first they only stood in key squares and intersections, as though taking note of the streets and the people who walked them. But slowly, their work became more direct. They posted notices on walls, parchment nailed into the wood, with with a single, decisive strike. The notices were written in formal language, but everyone understood the meaning. Gatherings would be monitored, speech would be measured, and certain subjects were now too dangerous to be discussed openly. In the evenings, those same soldiers could be seen moving in pairs, stopping to speak quietly with innkeepers or stable masters. Their tone was polite, even friendly, but their questions always came back to the same themes. Who had been traveling lately? Who met with whom? Who seemed to have more coin than they should? And when the soldiers left, the innkeepers and stable masters would find themselves lying awake, wondering if they had said too much or too little. The old rhythms of the city began to falter. Markets still opened, but customers kept their voices low. Churches still filled on Sundays, but the prayers felt heavier, as if the congregation feared their words might be overheard by more than just God. Even the children seemed quieter, their games losing the carefree edge they'd once had. Then came the first arrest. It was a young man, barely 20, taken in broad daylight from a street near the docks. He didn't resist. He simply went pale and glanced once toward the bakery across the road where his sister worked. The soldiers marched him away without explanation. By the next day, half the city had heard a different version of the story. Some said he was a thief. Others claimed he'd been caught passing messages. The truth, whatever it was, never made it into the official records. That single arrest was like a stone thrown into a still pond. The ripples spread fast, carrying fear with them. If they could take him, they could take anyone. And once that thought took hold, it was impossible to unthink it. What had begun as whispers in the streets was now visible in the open. The city was no longer a stage for quiet rumors. It had become the backdrop for a drama whose first act had only just begun. It started small, almost invisible to anyone not looking closely. A loaf of bread sold at half the stated price to a family known to be struggling. A cart left unlocked in an alley so that its contents might disappear into the hands of neighbors. A tavern keeper who, when soldiers came asking questions, answered in circles, never lying outright, but never offering the truth. These were quiet acts, carried out in corners and behind closed doors, but they were acts nonetheless. Each was a pebble placed in the path of the new order, and together they made it harder for that order to move forward unchallenged. The first real confrontation came in the marketplace. It was a day like any other stalls, heavy with produce, the air thick with the smell of roasted meat, until a soldier approached an elderly spice merchant. The merchant had been in the same spot for over 30 years, his jars of saffron and cinnamon neatly arranged like old friends. That day, the soldier informed him that his stall was being reassigned to a more compliant vendor. No explanation, no compensation. The merchant, perhaps forgetting for a moment the danger of the times, told the soldier exactly what he thought of that decision. His voice was not loud, but it carried. People stopped what they were doing. Heads turned. The soldier's jaw tightened. For a long moment, the only sound was the soft rattle of the spice jars in the breeze. The merchant was not taken away. Perhaps the soldier decided it wasn't worth the sign, but the damage, from the soldier's perspective, had been done. Defiance had been witnessed in public, and once seen, it could not be unseen. Word of the incident spread faster than the official notices on the walls. By nightfall, there were people who swore they had been there. Even if they hadn't, they told and retold the merchant's words, each version a little bolder than the last. In the retelling, The act became larger than the man, a reminder that the new power in the city, for all its boots and weapons, could still be challenged. The soldiers noticed the change in atmosphere. Their patrols grew tighter. They started stopping more carts, questioning more travelers. But the people noticed something too. Fear was no longer a one-way street. It flowed both ways now, if only in small trickles. By late autumn, the city seemed quieter in the daylight, but at night it hummed. Behind shuttered windows and in the cramped back rooms of bakeries, people began to gather, not in crowds large enough to be noticed, but in twos and threes. They spoke in low voices, leaning close, so that even the walls could not overhear. It began with questions. Where did they come from? How long will they stay? Then it turned to plans. A candle left burning in the upstairs window to warn of patrols. A smudge of chalk on a doorway to signal safe entry. Nothing that would draw the attention of an outsider, but enough for those who knew how to read the signs. The baker on West Street became one of the quiet leaders. By day his hands were dusted with flour, his smile as warm as his bread. By night he was a messenger, carrying slips of paper no larger than a coin, tucked into the folds of his apron. The notes were written in a simple code, trade orders for non-existent goods that, to the right eyes, spelled out instructions for safe houses or meeting points. One evening, as the lamps flickered low, a woman named Morale arrived at the bakery. She had been a seamstress before the occupation, known for her fine needlework and her habit of humming as she sewed. Now her hands trembled not from fear, but from holding too many secrets too tightly. She brought news from the riverside. A patrol had been ambushed, their uniforms stolen, their weapons hidden in an abandoned boathouse. The baker listened, nodded, and sent her away with a loaf of rye and a whispered blessing. What made these moments dangerous was not their scale, but their invisibility. An army can prepare for an uprising it can see, but an uprising that moves like water through the cracks of the city, spreading silently, finding every gap, cannot be stopped so easily. And so the nights grew busier, while the days pretended nothing was happening. Shopkeepers greeted soldiers politely. Children played in the streets. But under it all, the current of resistance was growing stronger, pulling more people into its flow. Somewhere in the dark, the first outlines of something bigger, a movement, perhaps, were beginning to take shape. It happened on a market day, when the square was at its most crowded. Merchants called out their prices in half a dozen dialects, the smell of spices and roasting chestnuts hanging thick in the cold air. Soldiers strolled among the stalls, rifles slung casually, eyes scanning for trouble. To them, this was just another day in a subdued city. But under the chatter and barter, a different rhythm was at work. Word had spread in the past week, passing from one trusted ear to the next. At the toll of the third bell, we begin. The instructions were simple. No shouting, no banners. Just a single act, repeated by as many hands as dared. When the bell rang, its tone rolling through the narrow streets, a young fishmonger stepped forward from his stall. Without a word, he tipped an entire barrel of herring into the gutter. The brine splashed across the boots of a passing soldier, who recoiled in surprise. Before he could react, an old woman selling onions appended her basket into the same gutter, the bulbs rolling like marbles over the cobblestones. Then it spread. A cheese seller let his wheels crash to the ground and roll away. A man selling candles snapped them in half and tossed them into the mud. Each act was small, almost absurd, in isolation, but together they brought the market to a halt. Commerce stopped. The square grew eerily still, except for the sound of the bell's fading echo. The soldiers, caught off guard, barked orders and shoved through the crowd. But there was no central leader to arrest, no banner to seize. The protest dissolved as quickly as it had begun, merchants returning to their stalls, shoppers pretending to haggle again, the streets swallowing the evidence. Only the lingering mess in the gutter told of what had just happened. For the occupiers, it was a nuisance. For the city, it was a spark. A message had been sent and received. We can act together. We can disrupt you without warning. It was the first public sign that the quiet resistance could turn visible and that it could do so on its own terms. That night, in kitchens and cellars, people spoke of the day's events in voices tinged with awe. They did not yet call it a rebellion, but the word beginning was on everyone's lips. The occupiers wasted no time. By dawn the next morning, the market square was ringed with uniformed men. Wooden barricades sprouted at every entry point, and the cheerful chaos of trading was replaced by long queues and suspicious glances. The smell of fresh bread, once a comfort, now carried the acrid undertone of burning coal from soldiers' stoves. Official proclamations, printed in blocky, foreign letters, were nailed to every post. They announced new public safety measures, Orwellian phrase that masked their true intent. Every merchant would be required to register their goods. Every transaction must be recorded. Anyone refusing would be fined, their stock confiscated. But the rules went further. No gatherings of more than 3 people in the street. No lingering near government buildings. No public discussion of political matters. Soldiers were granted authority to inspect homes without warning. It was a law written to suffocate daily life, to smother the possibility of another spark. The city reacted with a mix of fear and stubbornness. Market stalls reopened under the watchful eyes of guards, but the easy banter was gone. Shoppers kept their heads down. The laughter that once carried over the square had vanished. And yet, beneath the surface, something unexpected was happening. The crackdown had not crushed the memory of the protest, had preserved it. Each new restriction became another reminder of why the spark had been lit in the first place. Whispers carried further now, not less. People spoke in codes, traded small acts of defiance like contraband, an extra loaf baked without permit, a message smuggled in a sack of flour. The occupiers believed they had seized control. What they could not see, what they had perhaps never understood, was that control, enforced by fear, is brittle. It cracks under the smallest, sharpest pressure. And pressure, the city promised itself, was something it still knew how to apply. It began, as so many revolutions do, in kitchens and back rooms. The same homes where families once gathered for Sunday stews now became meeting points for whispered plans. Oil lamps were turned low, curtains drawn tight, and voices kept to a conspiratorial murmur. No one called it an organization yet. Would have been too dangerous, too formal. Instead, it was simply neighbors helping neighbors. A cobbler agreed to slip notes beneath the soles of boots. A baker offered to hide messages in sacks of flour. A midwife, who could move from house to house without arousing suspicion, became one of the network's most valuable couriers. They didn't all agree on the best path forward. Some spoke of sabotage, cutting telegraph wires, spoiling food stores. Others insisted the fight would be won with information, not destruction. But all shared one conviction: the occupiers could not be allowed to choke the city's spirit without meeting resistance. Everyday objects became tools of subterfuge. A bundle of firewood might conceal a roll of coated papers. A basket of fish could hide a pistol. Street musicians played songs whose verses contained instructions for those who knew how to listen. It was risky. Every day brought news of someone questioned, detained, or made to disappear. Yet the more the occupiers tightened their grip, the more hands found each other in the dark, ready to pass on what they had learned or what they could spare. They were no army. They had no uniforms, no banners. But they had something rarer: the willingness to risk everything, not for immediate victory, but for the preservation of the city's soul. And like roots beneath a winter field, their network grew silently, invisibly, until the day would come when it could break through the surface. It happened on a night so cold the river itself seemed to hold its breath. Frost slicked the cobblestones, muffling footsteps. The plan was simple, almost too simple for the risk. It carried, under cover of darkness, a small band would sabotage the supply line that kept the occupiers fed and armed. The target, a heavily guarded rail depot on the city's edge. By day it was a hive of activity, with trains arriving every hour, carrying crates marked in block letters and sealed with iron bands. But at night, the guards grew complacent, stamping their feet for warmth and huddling around oil drum fires. The group moved like shadows: a cobbler, a school teacher, 2 dock workers, and a boy barely old enough to shave. They carried no rifles, only crowbars, oil, and the tools of their trades. A single lantern was kept covered, its light barely a flicker. They worked quickly, loosening bolts on the main switch, spilling sand into the gears, soaking wooden freight supports with oil before setting them alight. The flames started small, almost shy, then roared upward as the wood caught, sending sparks into the black sky. The alarm came too late. By the time the guards scrambled to action, 2 supply cars were already ablaze, their contents exploding in dull, muffled bursts. The air reeked of burned grain and charred leather. By dawn, rumors spread faster than the smoke. No one knew exactly who had done it, and that was the point. In taverns, markets, and breadlines, the story grew with each telling. A strike against the occupiers, proof that they were not untouchable. For the resistance, it was a victory measured not in destroyed supplies, but in something far more precious: belief. The city had seen that its enemy could bleed, and that knowledge was a weapon in itself. The fires at the rail depot had barely cooled when the reprisals began. At dawn, soldiers in heavy boots poured into the streets, rifles slung, eyes scanning every doorway. They went house to house, banging on shutters, dragging men into the open, questioning women with icy politeness that barely concealed the threat beneath. Anyone without papers was taken. Anyone with calloused hands and no clear alibi was marked. For further interrogation, the school teacher's desk was overturned, his inkpots smashed. The dock workers' union hall was locked and boarded, its leader hauled away in the back of a covered truck. Posters appeared on walls overnight, announcing curfews and promising swift justice for saboteurs. Behind the printed words was a silent warning. We know it was you. The city's air grew taut, like a rope pulled too tight. People walked faster, spoke less. The laughter that had briefly returned after the depot fire vanished again, replaced by the scrape of boots and the creak of locked shutters. But for the resistance, the danger was doubled. Every arrest meant someone might break under pressure. Every raid risked uncovering a meeting place, a cache of supplies, a name whispered at the wrong moment. Still, even in fear, the memory of the flames lingered. Some clung to it like a talisman. Others cursed it as reckless. Yet all of them, friend stranger, or silent watcher, had seen proof that the occupiers could be hurt. And that, the resistance knew, was why the retaliation was so fierce. They had struck a nerve. And now, the question was not if the enemy would strike back, but how far they would go. The crackdown forced the resistance to shed its skin. Meeting in the open, even in the back rooms of friendly shops, was no longer an option. The city had become a web of listening ears, some paid in cash, others in the currency of fear. They learned to speak in fragments. A shoemaker might mention a new shipment of leather that was really a message about incoming weapons. A florist's delivery of winter roses could mean a safe house was ready. Each code was simple, mundane, just enough to pass unnoticed. Papers were forged in candlelit rooms, their ink still damp when slid into false-bottomed drawers. Messages were written in lemon juice, invisible until warmed over a flame. Even the children played there, part slipping notes between loaves of bread, or singing songs whose verses carried directions only their parents understood. The enemy's patrols grew more unpredictable. Sometimes they came in daylight, uniforms gleaming. Other times they moved like phantoms in the night, seizing people from their beds. To survive, the resistance began using multiple hideouts, never sleeping in the same place twice. And yet, there was a strange sense of momentum. Each raid, each arrest, was met with new recruits, people who'd had enough of bowing their heads. It wasn't bravery alone that kept them going. It was the quiet understanding that if they stopped now, the fear would never lift in the shadows. Under the watchful eyes of the occupiers, they began to plan again, not for survival this time, but for something larger, something that might turn the whispers back into a roar. The idea began as a half-spoken thought over a shared crust of bread. By nightfall, it had grown into a plan, dangerous, almost reckless, but with the potential to shake the occupiers to their core. They would target the rail lines, not just to damage them, but to halt the endless flow of supplies and reinforcements that kept the enemy's grip so tight. Every shipment delayed would starve the war machine. Every day of disruption, another breath of freedom. The planning was meticulous. Maps were studied until the ink blurred in tired eyes. Schedules were memorized. Small teams, each sworn to secrecy, would handle different pieces, one to scout the tracks, another to secure explosives, another to create diversions in the city. The danger wasn't only in the work itself. If caught, they wouldn't face prison. They'd vanish. Everyone knew it. And yet, as each piece of the plan took shape, the group seemed lighter, as if purpose itself had stripped away the heaviness of fear. They met in barns, in the backs of hay wagons, in abandoned mills. Every whisper carried the same unspoken truth. This was the kind of risk you only took if you believed, truly believed, that victory was possible. When the night finally came, it was moonless. The teams moved like shadows, their footsteps swallowed by the damp earth. Somewhere far off, an owl called a sound so ordinary, it made the moment feel almost unreal. But the air was charged, as if the land itself was holding its breath. If it worked, the enemy would wake to chaos. If it failed, dawn might never come for those in the field. The first explosion was not the loudest. It was the second, a heartbeat later, that split the night wide open. Metal shrieked as rail twisted and tore from the earth, a sound unlike anything. Nature made a raw, violent cry. From the tree line, the saboteurs watched their work unfold. Sparks leaped into the darkness, brief as fireflies, before vanishing. Somewhere in the distance, the panicked bellow of an engine's whistle cut through the air too late to stop. The train never saw it coming. One moment, it was gliding through the countryside, its wheels singing against steel. The next, it was chaos. Cars lurching, tilting, collapsing like a string of toppled dominoes. Crates split open, spilling grain, munitions, and twisted iron across the tracks. But the mission wasn't over. Small fires lit the night as teams moved quickly, destroying what they could, scattering before the soldiers could arrive. The forest became their shield, its shadows swallowing them whole. For the locals, the news spread by morning like a wind through dry grass. People whispered over water pumps and in crowded markets about the night the occupiers' iron road was broken. In those hushed tones was something dangerous, hope. The retaliation came swiftly. Roadblocks choked the city gates. Soldiers stormed into homes without knocking. Entire families were questioned, some taken away. Yet, even as fear crept back in, the damage had been done. The enemy had been reminded that their control was not absolute, that the land itself could rise against them. In the quiet after, the survivors of the raid did not celebrate openly, but when their eyes met across a street or a marketplace, there was a flicker of silent recognition that they had struck a blow that would be remembered by dawn. The twisted remains of the railway lay smoking under a pale sky. The air smelled of scorched wood and hot metal, and the frost underfoot crunched as soldiers paced the wreckage, their boots grinding fragments of splintered timber into the earth. The occupiers worked quickly, barking orders in clipped voices, trying to restore the lifeline that had been severed in the night. But repairs would take days they could not afford. Each hour the tracks lay broken was another hour of delayed supplies, stalled troop movements, and a fraying sense of control. For the people in nearby villages, the morning brought a mixture of dread and exhilaration. Mothers kept their children indoors, wary of stray patrols. Farmers tilled fields under watchful eyes, pretending not to notice the increased guard presence. Yet beneath the routine lay an undeniable truth. Something had shifted in the market. Square, an old man sold bread with a faint, almost imperceptible smile. He had seen occupiers come and go before, but rarely had he seen them this unsettled. To him, the broken tracks were more than sabotaged. They were a promise that the land still belonged to its own. Word of the strike traveled far beyond the region. Couriers carried whispers to distant towns. Resistance groups passed coded messages through safe hands. And in hidden rooms lit by a single lamp, maps were unfurled and studied. This was no longer just about survival. It was about preservation in the right places, at the right time, until the great machine of occupation began to grind itself to pieces. In the weeks that followed, smaller acts of defiance multiplied. A supply convoy found its fuel drained overnight. A telegraph line, crucial for relaying orders, mysteriously went dead. Each disruption was a thread pulled from the occupiers' tapestry of control. The railway sabotage had been one night, but its echoes promised many more to come. The retaliation came swiftly. Within 48 hours, military trucks rolled into villages along the railway corridor, their engines growling like caged beasts. Soldiers disembarked in rigid formation, rifles at the ready, their faces set in that expressionless mask that hides both fear and cruelty. Homes were searched without warning, doors kicked in, cupboards overturned, mattresses slashed open with bayonets. In the square, a list of suspected saboteurs was read aloud, names called into the cold air. Some men were seized on the spot. Others had fled days before, warned by a chain of whispers that moved faster than the telegraph. Curfews were announced. Travel between villages now required written permits, stamped with an official seal. Guard posts sprang up along main roads, where soldiers inspected carts and demanded to know why a farmer's hands smelled faintly of oil or why a woman's dress carried a trace of coal dust. For the resistance, the clampdown was a nightmare. On one side lay exposure, capture, interrogation, the inevitable betrayals that fear could force from even the strongest hearts. On the other side lay inaction, the slow suffocation of morale. Meetings moved deeper underground, sometimes literally. In old wine cellars, under the cover of damp stone and the smell of earth, plans were whispered over flickering lanterns. Messages were shortened to single sentences, carved into small scraps of wood that could be burned at a moment's notice. And yet, for all their caution, there were losses. One runner, barely 17, was taken at a checkpoint. A mechanic who had helped loosen the railway bolts vanished from his workshop, leaving behind only a cooling cup of tea and a half-mended bicycle. The occupiers believed this fear would break the will of the people, but in reality it forged something harder, an understanding that survival now meant more than hiding. It meant adapting faster than the enemy, thinking 3 moves ahead, and accepting that not everyone would live to see the day the tracks ran free again. When the walls closed in, they did not break through them, they slipped through the cracks. The resistance shifted to what they called ghost tactics, actions so fleeting and precise that by the time the occupiers reacted, there was nothing left to catch. Sabotage no longer meant derailing an entire train in broad daylight. It meant loosening a single bolt on a key bridge so that it had to be closed for repairs for 3 days, time enough to delay troop movements without inviting mass reprisals. It meant replacing barrels of lamp oil in the enemy's storage depots with water, so lanterns sputtered out at the worst possible moments. Messages were carried not by men in obvious haste, but by grandmothers strolling with baskets of laundry, or shepherds leading their flocks past guard posts. One shepherd, in particular, became legendary. He tied coated ribbons to the horns of his goats, each color indicating a different safe house. Radio operators changed locations nightly, setting up makeshift transmitters in barns, attics, even abandoned wells. Every broadcast was kept under 2 minutes to avoid detection, the airwaves filled with brief bursts of coordinates, warnings, and a few carefully chosen lies to confuse enemy patrols. And still, there was risk. Every quiet act, every accident that slowed the occupiers, was another step along a thin fraying rope. The people who walked it knew that if they slipped, there would be no rescue. But in the strange arithmetic of occupation, danger became its own form of currency. The more they spent, the richer their courage grew. To the occupiers, the resistance began to feel less like an enemy army and more like a phantom presence. They were nowhere and everywhere, seen only in the afterimage of what they'd undone. It began with a whisper passed from a farmhand to a baker, from a baker to a railway worker. A heavily guarded supply train was scheduled to cross the Veryville Bridge at dusk, carrying munitions that would fuel the enemy for months. Destroying that bridge outright was impossible. It was too heavily watched, too vital, but damaging it just enough to stall the train without bringing it down. That could be done, and if the train stopped in the valley below, the resistance could strike where the guards least expected. The plan required perfect timing. A small team would slip down to the bridge's understructure, plant charges on one of the central joints, and retreat before the train arrived. The explosion wouldn't collapse the bridge, but it would force an emergency halt. Rain fell in a steady sheet as the team moved for figures in dark wool, their boots sinking into mud. Under the bridge, the sound of the river masked their tools. The leader, a former railway engineer, worked by touch more than sight, his fingers steady even as the water rose around his ankles. The explosion was muffled, a dull crack beneath the storm. Minutes later, the train's whistle pierced the mist. It slowed, brakes squealing, until it came to a stop exactly where they'd hoped. From the surrounding hills, more shadows emerged: farmers, mechanics, a schoolteacher with a rifle. The ambush was quick and decisive. Within minutes, the enemy guards were disarmed, the cargo seized, and the train set alight. Flames reflected off the rain-slick metal, a beacon in the dark. For days afterward, the occupiers scoured the countryside, but the culprits had already melted away into fields and forests. The victory was more than strategic. It was proof to the occupiers, to the resistance, and to the silent majority watching from the sidelines that the phantom could strike in daylight and still vanish into the night. The morning after the Veryville ambush, the occupiers struck back with a precision that felt almost personal. Roadblocks sprang up on every major route, manned by soldiers with eyes that searched not just bags and carts, but faces measuring every twitch, every heartbeat. Posters appeared on walls and shop doors, crude sketches of suspected saboteurs, most of them invented. The reward offered for information was more money than a farmhand might see in a year. Whispers grew dangerous. Even neighbors began watching one another with new suspicion. Raids swept through villages without warning. Soldiers would pound on a door before dawn, dragging out entire families for questioning. Those who returned spoke of long hours under bright lights, of questions asked again and again, until truth and lies blurred into one. The countryside itself seemed to turn hostile. Trains were searched at every stop, fields were patrolled. Even church services saw the presence of armed men in the back pews. The occupiers understood something vital. Fear could do the work of an entire battalion, but in their zeal, they made a critical mistake. In tightening their grip so ruthlessly, they pushed more ordinary citizens toward the very cause they hoped to crush. The blacksmith whose forge had been searched without reason began leaving tools hidden along certain lanes. The widow whose pantry had been emptied took to carrying messages sewn into the hem of her dress. The resistance adapted to meetings moved deeper into the woods, Coded signals grew more intricate, and safe houses were abandoned for ever-shifting shelters. If the occupiers wanted to play a game of shadows, the phantom would gladly match them step for step, and though the air was thick with tension, beneath it ran something the enemy couldn't touch, a quiet, stubborn current of defiance that only grew stronger with each act of cruelty.